So my purpose here is to compare two conceptions of consciousness. One of them is rather Eastern and the other one is rather Western. These two conceptions of consciousness are almost orthogonal in some way, but some people have thought that they might have something in common and something that can be compared. To give us a taste of what this comparison might be, I have written here two sentences, one from a Buddhist author, Shantarakshita, and the other one from a contemporary neurobiologist, a very important neurobiologist called Anil Seth. In the first sentence, Shantarakshita says, "By its nature, consciousness cannot observe an object other than itself," which means that in fact there is no outer object and that any object that is supposedly attended to by consciousness is in fact a production of consciousness. And Anil Seth said something that looks similar because he said, perception is controlled hallucination. That means that when you believe you perceive something out there, in fact, you hallucinate an object. And he added something very important, and which might be a difference with the sentence of Shantarakshita. He added, our brain is hallucinating a world. It's just that when we agree about our hallucinations, we call that reality. In other terms, reality is just shared hallucination, in his view, in the view of Anil Seth. But the very important point here I want to stress is the difference between the first and the second sentence. Even though they look very similar, because in both cases you think that objects are just projections of consciousness or projections of something else than the object itself, in fact, in the first case you just have consciousness. In the second case you have the brain. The brain hallucinates something, not consciousness itself. Okay, so in a proper Buddhist view, in this kind of Buddhist view, which is very close to the school of Chittamatra, namely the school of mind only, in this case, even the brain would be a hallucination. And therefore, you could not say that our brain is producing a hallucination. So here you see the part of similarity and huge difference between the two views. As I told you, these two views of consciousness are almost opposite. One can characterize them as third person on the one side and first person on the other side. The standard Western view, which is dominated by a kind of neuro-reductionism, is essentially a third person view. Consciousness here is supposed to be a marginal feature of nature, construed as a set of interacting objects. And these interacting objects are inert, non-sentient, and material. So one believes that consciousness can come out of these objects. But of course, in order to believe that, you just have to forget that these objects are presented qua objects of consciousness. Now, the view that was defended by many schools of Buddhism, maybe not all, but many schools of Buddhism, is rather a first-person view of consciousness. Consciousness here is what is primarily given. Mental and material phenomena both appear on the constant background of the luminosity of consciousness. So let me present briefly the materialist or physicalist view of consciousness, which is often defended by many neurobiologists. Here again, not all of them, but I would say most of them. For instance, I can list a series of sentences taken from these neurobiologists. The first sentence is by Christoph Koch. He says, the entire brain is sufficient for consciousness. That means that In order to produce consciousness, you just need the brain and nothing else. Dennett said things that are usually considered as more radical, even more radical, because he said he equates, in fact, consciousness and biological phenomena. He said consciousness is a physical, biological phenomenon like reproduction. And Stanislas Dehaene, said something almost very similar because he also uses the verb to be. The verb to be, that means that he equates the two. He equates consciousness and something that is material. He said consciousness is global information broadcasting within the cortex. And he also said much is already known about how brains generate consciousness. So either the brain or a certain process in the brain is consciousness, or this process or the brain generates consciousness. Things are not exactly equivalent, but mostly they say that, the brain is basic and consciousness is derivative. The arguments in favor of this materialist or physicalist view of consciousness are the following. First of all, the neuro-experiential correlation. Whenever you have an experience, there is a certain event in your brain that is correlated to this experiential event. The second point is that precise interventions on the brain modify or trigger experiences as reported by subjects. So in a certain way, you can act on the brain and produce an experience. But beware, because these correlations are completely symmetric. If an experience is correlated to a brain event, then the brain event is correlated to this experience. So here you don't have the notion that one is more fundamental than the other. And second point, the same. Even interventions can work the other way around. You can, for instance, intervene on your experience. You can change your experience voluntarily, and then the brain is modified. A certain event in the brain will be triggered by a choice to think of something, and even if you train a lot, for instance, if you meditate a lot, or if you do any kind of mental training, then your brain will be hugely modified, even in its anatomy. So you can intervene on experience and change the brain. So the argument in favor of the basic character of the brain with respect to consciousness can be turned the other way around. And also, there is something that almost no physicalist thinker is really paying sufficient attention, is what David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is not the hard problem of every aspect of consciousness. It is the hard problem of a certain very essential aspect of consciousness, which is nothing else than lived experience. The hard problem of consciousness can be formulated this way. How is it possible for a brain process to generate lived experience of red? Not just the tendency to say red, not just the tendency for a human body to utter the word red, nor the behavioral ability to sort a red object with other red objects, but the very lived experience, the lived experience itself of seeing red. And, you know, the problem is that this aspect of consciousness is, as I told you, essential. Consciousness would not be consciousness without lived experience. And yet, many cognitive scientists insisted that they can redefine consciousness in terms that do not involve lived experience. So much so that some of them, essentially NetBlock, decided to make a difference between two definitions of consciousness, two aspects of consciousness. The one which is taken into account by the cognitive science is called access consciousness, because it's the set of the functions that are ascribed to consciousness. So access consciousness is the set of all the functions that are ascribed to consciousness in everyday language and also in the cognitive science. But another aspect or another definition of consciousness is called phenomenal consciousness. That means the lived aspect of consciousness. The fact that there is something it is like to be a conscious being. Okay? And this one is not accounted by any cognitive theory of consciousness. Okay, so what are the reactions of the cognitive scientists who tend to be materialists when they think of this hard problem that was formulated by David Chalmers? Usually their reaction is essentially to dismiss the hard problem. So there are three ways to dismiss the hard problem. One of them is deflationism, namely redefine consciousness with no reference to experience in it. And for instance, Dehaene in 2017 said, "We suggest that the word consciousness conflates two different types of information processing computations in the brain. First, the selection of information for global broadcasting, thus making it available for report. And secondly, self-monitoring." So, in fact, Dehaene redefines consciousness as global availability of information, one, and two, self-monitoring, namely reflectivity. Okay, but here in these 2 points, there is nothing like experience, just 2 functions, synthesis and reflectivity, nothing more. The second mode of, explaining consciousness away is called eliminativism. According to eliminativism, experience or phenomenal consciousness is a pre-scientific concept that will disappear as we better understand the brain. So many cognitive scientists say, oh, don't pay too much attention to this lived experience. At any rate, this will soon be said a false problem. Moreover, in order to promote this attitude of elimination of the problem of lived experience, the mentalistic vocabulary is progressively eliminated. Namely, instead of speaking of fear and so on, you may try to speak of the excitation of the right area of the brain, which is correlated with fear. The third possibility to eliminate the hard problem is called illusionism. Illusionism is a strange conception, almost a surrealist conception, but a conception that was formulated by some cognitive scientists, especially by Kate Frankish in 2016. According to Frankish, phenomenal consciousness, as usually conceived, is illusory. So he says literally that lived experience is illusory. According to illusionists, our sense that it is like something to undergo conscious experiences is due to the fact that we systematically misrepresent them as having phenomenal properties. So we believe we have lived experience, but in fact we don't. We overinterpret our own cognitive processing as lived experience, but in fact this is an illusion. Well, we'll speak about that later. Let me just say that I think that this conception is just a contradiction in terms. Now, the Buddhist view of consciousness is very different. We can distinguish at least two views of consciousness in Buddhism, and maybe a third one just after that. The first one, the first conception of consciousness in Buddhism is essentially close to dualism, but a dualism that is quite special. So this kind of dualism was presented in the Abhidharma literature and also in Dharmakirti's epistemology. As I told you, this dualism is not a standard dualism. It's not a dualism of substances, as in René Descartes, for instance, dualism of the res extensa and the res cogitans, dualism of the extended thing and the thinking thing. It is what Georges Dreyfus calls an event dualism. In fact, there are, according to these Buddhist texts, there are two types of phenomena, one material and a second one mental. But all these phenomena are presented in experience. This differs from mind-body dualism in that it takes mind and body not as substances but as momentary events. Okay. The second conception of Buddhism is a variety of idealism. For instance, one sentence, celebrated sentence, is ascribed to the Buddha himself. The three realms of existence, he said, are merely mind, where he meant essentially consciousness. Also, the Chittamatra school of Buddhism, namely the mind-only school of Buddhism, says just as after a dream, one realizes there is no object other than the mind itself. So usually in a dream, when you wake up, you say, oh, all these things I have said, all these things I have seen, in fact, are just my own hallucinations. And here it's the same. It's the same, but the difference is that when you speak of a dream, you can say, oh, it's my brain which hallucinated the dream. But here, who hallucinated the brain itself? And here you land into an absolute idealism, which was conveyed by the Chittamatra. Another typically Chittamatra saying was taken from Tsultrim Gyamtso Rinpoche, Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. And this sentence is the following: the luminous, self-aware, non-conceptual mind that is experienced in meditation is absolute reality. So what you experience is absolute reality. You don't have to look for absolute reality elsewhere than in experience itself. This is a kind of idealism, I would say. But there is also another conception of consciousness, a much more deconstructive conception of consciousness, which was presented by Madhyamaka, the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, which can be translated by the middle way. Yet there are two varieties of the middle way. The most extreme is called Rangtong Madhyamaka. Rangtong is a Tibetan word and Madhyamaka is a Sanskrit word. But this means that this kind of Madhyamaka teaches the emptiness of self, the emptiness of everything, including oneself. So this kind of Madhyamaka is uncompromising in its refutation of all conceptual attempts to grasp the nature of the Absolute. So even the idea that the Absolute is tantamount to experience itself is criticized by this variety of Madhyamaka. There is also another variety of Madhyamaka called Shentong Madhyamaka. Shentong here again is a Tibetan word, and it means emptiness of other, namely everything else than my own experience is empty. It's relative. It has no substance, no own being. So let me quote Tsultrim Gyatso Rinpoche. Because Shentong stresses the luminous knowing aspect of the mind, it has often been confused with Chittamatra. But Shentong doesn't accept the Chittamatra view that consciousness is truly existent. Supporters of Shentong hold the Madhyamaka view that consciousness is non-arising and without self-nature. So clearly there is a similarity with Chittamatra, and yet the idea that there is no thing like a substantial consciousness. Interestingly, the materialists have sought some support from Madhyamaka. And they said, okay, since Madhyamaka is deconstructing consciousness, then our materialist, physicalist deconstruction of consciousness, maybe even claiming that it's an illusion, is supported by the Madhyamaka. And so materialism is something that Madhyamaka would not reject. So this is the next step of our inquiry. Is it true that Madhyamaka can really support a materialist view of consciousness?